And so we will email out the recording to everyone who registered, along with all of the resources that we share today, so that you can revisit this conversation. Maybe share it with folks who couldn't join us today, and continue this conversation outside of the hour that we have together. My name is Krista Reed. I'm a program director here at the Ability Challenge. My background is as a special ed teacher and then a charter school-based and network-based special ed leader. And I'm joined today by my colleague Rachel, who's also a program director. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Rachel. Oh, you're on mute, girl. Oh, you can't. I think I can unmute you.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Burley. I'm also a program director here with the Ability Challenge. Similarly to Krista, my background is as a special education teacher and leader, and I'm based in Nashville, Tennessee.
Together, we are going to talk to you today about responding to challenging behavior. I want to tell you a little bit about our organization. Um, so I'll let Rachel take that away.
Yeah, so if you're unfamiliar, we are an organization called the Ability Challenge, and what we do is partner with schools, districts, and networks to help leaders and teachers build authentically inclusive school communities that meet the needs of all students. And so our work is grounded in the Thrive framework, which is our evidence-based roadmap for the knowledge, mindsets, and practices required of leaders and educators to create the optimal conditions for diverse learners. So you can see those components listed here on the graphic on the left. Um, and that kind of grounds the work that we do. And so, as Krista said, this is the second session of a three-part series for our fall webinar focused on student behavior. So, our goal for our time together is that you're able to differentiate between traditional and problem-solving approaches when it comes to behavior, understand the importance of antecedent strategies and lagging skill instruction in responding to challenging behavior, and identify some universal supports and conditions that support all learners. And so, if you missed our first session, we're going to quickly go through some of those big ideas. But today's session is going to focus more on how we apply the understanding that behavior is a form of communication and how we can adjust our responses based on what we learn through the problem-solving approach. And so, what this is going to look like is we are going to talk a little bit about the problem-solving approach, talk about the functions of behaviors and why they are key to unlocking solutions, then look at some aligned intervention strategies to maximize our impact and effectiveness, and then we'll close with some final reflections and resources for you all.
So we asked you earlier why you wanted to talk about behavior today. This is something we shared in our last conversation. Why did we want to have a series on behavior? Um, when we asked teachers, and when the Rand Corporation asked teachers, what are the top three sources of stress in your job right now? And this is back in 2024, but I imagine if they were to give the same survey again today, very similar results. Teachers said managing student behavior was the top stressor in their work. And it matters, right? Because teacher well being and retention are key to all of the work that we do. It's key to serving students with disabilities well in our schools. We need adults to be able to show up to school every day and do their best work and be less stressed. Teachers are telling us loud and clear that the things that we've been doing and the tools that we have don't feel like they're working, and it's impacting them in very profound ways. I'm sure we can all feel that, especially at this time of year. Holidays are still a ways away, so I can understand why folks might, in early November, want to dig into behavior. In our work with schools, and in the research too, we see two approaches to dealing with challenging behavior. We talked about these two approaches in our first session of this series. So, just as a quick, brief overview, the first approach that we see, we're calling the punitive approach, right? It's really a traditional sort of crime and punishment framework. We figure out, okay, the student has challenging behavior. We figure out what rule was broken when they did that thing. We determine the infraction according to our handbook, our student handbook. Then we deliver the appropriate punishment. In this framework, right, persistently challenging behavior from a student is probably going to result in escalating punishments, consequences. They're becoming more and more severe. We're trying to motivate the student to make a different choice about how they behave. And then the other approach, in the problem solving approach, we start to see folks shift. Students' challenging behavior is met with teams that are curious and want to figure out why behavior is happening, right? This is the type of approach we advocate for, and we really help schools develop and refine because we know that this works. It's evidence-based, it's backed by research, and we see it being much more effective. And at the heart of this is this core belief, which I think someone even put in the chat, right? Behavior is communication. Behavior tells us something. And in our last session, we showed this visual analogy of behavior being an iceberg, right? At the top, the visible part above the surface of the water, that's an observable behavior that a student is exhibiting. But it's an expression of something deeper, right? Under the surface is where we find out why the behavior is occurring. There's unsolved problems and unmet needs that students are communicating to us through their actions and their behavior. It's like we said earlier with the problem solving approach, right? Effective teams know and believe that behavior, because it's communication, is signaling to us to pay close attention and learn more about what's below the surface. So when a student does exhibit challenging behavior, those teams engage in problem solving to understand why. And that helps them respond more effectively. Not just because they're caring, empathetic individuals, right, who want to know what's going on, but because that is a key to unlocking more effective responses, creating plans and approaches that actually fix something over time. We spent some time on this together last time about the functions of behavior. We said because behavior is communication, it means it's functional. It serves a purpose and it tells us something about the nature of that student's problems or unmet needs. So, behavior can serve one of four main functions: escape, access, attention, or automatic or sensory. We're going to talk through really quickly what those mean, give a few examples so that, this is a refresher for you or you're not familiar with the functions of behavior. You can anchor your learning today because we're going to talk about what does knowing the functions help you do? What are some of the responses you might adjust once you know this? The first function we'll talk about is escape, which is when students engage in behavior that serves to remove them from a demanding or an unwanted task. So here's an example. When prompted to engage in a group discussion, Jackson puts his head down and stays at his desk. Right? He's escaping joining the group discussion by putting his head down. Next, we have access, which is when students engage in behavior to gain access to something desirable, either an item or an activity. They're trying to access something, which is the opposite of trying to escape something. So, for example, when the class moves to the carpet for story time, Alyssa remains at the iPad center and yells, cries, scratches when adults attempt to redirect her to the carpet. She wants access to that iPad. It's not that she doesn't want story time, it's that she wants that iPad. The third function that we mentioned is attention, which means that students engage in a behavior because it allows them to access attention from other people. Could be positive, could be negative, could be adults, could be peers, could be a preferred adult, a specific person, right? Henry is given independent work in math and initiates conversations with peers instead of beginning his work. Finally, we have automatic or sensory. And this involves students engaging in behaviors that provide internal satisfaction or sensory input, which can be a way to self soothe. So here's an example. When walking in the hallway, Mandy will hum and sing loudly while touching her ears. Sometimes it's to get access to stimulation, or it might be to block something out. Figuring out what the function of a behavior is not guesswork, right? We're not making a bunch of assumptions. The way that teams figure this out is they are very data driven. They conduct observations of the student multiple observations to look for patterns between what we call the ABCs of behavior, right? So they look at the antecedents. They see what happens just before the behavior happens. Then they take note of what the behavior is and also pay attention to the consequences. And I don't mean consequences in a traditional punishment way, right? Like, did they go to the office? Just what happens right after? What is the thing that occurs immediately following the behavior? Does everybody laugh? Does everyone ignore it? Does the student have to continue to do the work that they're trying to escape, or do they get a break? Those are all clues that teams put together to then come up with a hypothesized function. They say, we're noticing a pattern, and we think that the student engages in this behavior because it meets this function or this need for them. Last time we were together, we shared a resource with folks, which is a helpful data collection sheet, right? It's pretty simple, but an important tool to have in your toolkit as you start to think about, I need to understand more about the student's behavior. I want to come up with a hypothesis. By the end of today, I think you'll see why that's really, really helpful and useful because it's going to guide your response. We also have a new blog post up for the month of November um, about exactly that, the problem solving behavior or problem solving approach to behavior and some of the tools that you might use. So encourage you to check out our blog, and we will share the ABC data collection sheet with you also when we share the presentation. So what do we know about the importance of finding that function? What we know and what research tells us is that having function-based interventions that match and are aligned to an understanding of the function are more likely to reduce challenging behaviors and increase appropriate behaviors for students with and without disabilities. Right? Researchers, Jong and Copeland, they did a review of 24 different studies about function-based and non-function-based interventions, and they found not only were they just as easy to use as other interventions, but they worked better. They're more effective. And so, therefore, when given the choice, teams should try to align their responses and their interventions to an understanding of function. It's going to pay off to do that work and to come up with that hypothesis. Now, back to the two approaches to challenging behavior, right? We've really been talking so far about steps one and two, identifying the problem and doing some analysis about it to arrive at a hypothesis. So now we're going to really think about that third part of problem solving approach, which is now what do we do? What's our plan for how we respond to the student's behavior in light of what we now know about it? When we think about the punitive approach, what is at the heart of that is often an assumption that students misbehave because they want to. It's a willful, conscious choice. And so it stands to reason that they'll be motivated if we reward them or provide the right consequences, right? Kids do well if they want to do well, is kind of what we are saying when we apply that approach. With the problem solving approach, there's a totally different set of assumptions underneath of it, right? Behaviors communication, but also kids do well if they can. Meaning, if they have the skills to do well and meet our expectations, of course they want to do that. It is much easier to go through school and meet expectations than it is to not. This perspective is the opposite of kids do well if they want to, right? It asserts that students would behave if they possess the necessary skills required to behave in the expected ways. So these teams focus on something different rather than rewards and consequences. They are focused on teaching new skills, helping the student practice and generalize those skills, and giving them feedback and support to make those skills more automatic and more readily accessible. When you think about it, these teams are applying something that I think we do very naturally in the world of academics, which is think about what we know about the brain and about neuroscience. The idea of growth mindset, neuroplasticity, right? Tells us that the brain's physical changes happen in response to repeated experiences and practice. So just like students can learn to read and solve math problems after they practice and are explicitly taught, they can do the same thing when it comes to behavior, emotional regulation, impulse control, social skills. It's not about willpower or character, right? We would never tell a student like if you just want to read, you'll you'll do it, right? Just want to read more. It's about building neural pathways through repetition and support, not through wanting it more. The concept of growth mindset applies equally to academics and behavior. And it combats the fixed mindset, right, that labels kids bad or difficult or, beyond hope. It's a hopeful way to think about change. Excuse me. Every student has the capacity to grow and develop new skills, and the same is true in behavior. At its core, the problem solving approach requires us to believe this across both domains. So, if we adopt this belief, right, that students can grow and develop new skills, well, what are the skills we're talking about? Yes, Becky, presuming competence. Those two ideas are very connected, right? I can presume that you could be competent at this. Maybe you do know how to do these things and you need more practice and support. Maybe you can do them in one context and not another. I love that. Here's a list of some of the skills that might be lagging for students who are exhibiting challenging behavior. They might be in the area of executive functioning. They might be in the areas of emotional regulation, social skills, sensory regulation, and academic skills. Right now, I just want you to think of a student that you've worked with who exhibited challenging behavior and use the chat to share which lagging skills were preventing them from exhibiting the expected behavior. And if you say academic skills, I want you to say a little bit more because that's its own that's its own slide and list. But go ahead and use the chat feature right now and tell us for that student, what were some of the lagging skills that you think might have been at play? Yeah, and it definitely could be a mix of things, right? Very rarely is a student lagging in just one discrete, tiny skill. Impulse control, focus, turn taking, right? Coping with the frustration of having to wait, being able to do that. Absolutely. And here's the list of lagging academic skills just that I could rattle off the top of my head, right? Reading and language comprehension difficulties, writing and fine motor challenges. Sometimes things that are a little harder for us as lay people to measure, processing speed, working memory limitations. Those might be things that are happening across content areas. As educators, we know that those academic skill gaps can result in frustration and maladaptive coping or masking behaviors. And when students struggle academically, they communicate that to us behaviorally, right? These are some of the most common academic challenges that are at the root of challenging behavior. A lot of times this manifests as escape functions, right? Unable to do the work. And so I'm going to find a way to escape the work that I find difficult. Developing new skills that students are lagging behind on requires teaching and consistent practice in supportive environments. Good plans and good responses take all of that into account, right? There is a clear plan for who, where, and when students are going to get a chance to practice and learn new skills. When educators provide opportunities for practice and coaching and feedback rather than simply punishing a student for not displaying a skill that they don't have yet, they're helping students build stronger neural connections for self-regulation and appropriate responses, right? I want you to think about some of the behavior plans or approaches that you've seen, and how often do you see a plan for teaching and practicing some of the skills that we just saw? If your plans and if your approaches to challenging behavior don't take into account, well, when is the student going to learn impulse control, right? That might be one of the keys that's missing. We might be expecting students to display behaviors that they're not ready to yet, that they don't have. Let's talk about the other piece of this, right? Because that skill instruction takes time. Learning a new skill, especially something as complex as a new behavior or an executive suite of executive functioning skills, is not quick, especially for students with disabilities who are also probably learning a lot of other skills and developing a lot of other complex skills at the same time. So, what do we do in the meantime while students are developing and generalizing what they're learning? Well, at the current stage, we have a better understanding of the student's behavior and the why behind it, the function. We know what the current behavior is. And from there, we can create sort of this short term goal for the student to meet that function in a new way. So we call it a replacement behavior. We teach the student an acceptable action that they can do instead of a challenging behavior. The key here is that it has to still meet the same function. And hopefully, it's something that requires less effort, produces more reliable results, and it builds on what the student can already do, what they already know, and what they're able to do. Let's talk a little bit about those replacement behaviors and how we can leverage what we know about the function.
Awesome. So the first behavior we're going to talk about is escape. So we know that escape behavior occurs when students want to get away from something they may find challenging, like a difficult task or a noisy environment. So when we think about those replacement behaviors, um, some of those could be asking for a break, teaching a student to ask for help, or communicate their needs in a different way. And I think one thing to remember here is that these behaviors have to be taught. Next is access. So access behaviors happen when a student is trying to get a tangible item or activity. Replacement behaviors might include requesting an item using words or pictures or an AAC device, using a first then board to know when preferred items are available. So first this, and then teaching them to wait appropriately for a turn with an item. For attention behaviors, it's all about getting social interaction from either adults or peers. And we know that a lot of time students seeking attention are okay with positive or negative. So when we think about the replacement behaviors, we want to be specific in how we teach them how to gain attention. So raising their hand to speak, asking politely for help or attention, or using a signal card to request an interaction. Finally, automatic or sensory behaviors are usually self-stimulatory, so students do them because they feel good or reduce discomfort. Replacement behaviors could look like using fidgets or stress balls, asking for a sensory break, or engaging in socially appropriate sensory activities like doodling or listening to music. One thing we want to note here is that it's important to consult relevant related service professionals when we're thinking through using a replacement behavior for sensory. So consulting with either your OT or behavior analyst to make sure that those strategies are safe and effective for students. But the takeaway here is that by understanding the function of the behavior, we can match it with the replacement behavior that serves the same purpose and allows the student to get their needs met without disrupting learning or creating an unsafe environment.
I want to just try to apply this to a scenario, right? So if we know that replacement behaviors have to serve the same function, be easier, right, and more efficient than the problem behavior, and be something that we can consistently reinforce until it becomes a habit. Here's a scenario. So the team is working with Marcus. One of the things that they've noticed is that during quiet reading or test taking, Marcus taps his pencil loudly, clicks his pen, and drums on his desk. And the hypothesized function here is that he's meeting a sensory need for movement and auditory stimulation. Kind of always busy. And this is one of the ways that it's challenging folks, right? It's noisy, it's disruptive, um, and it just bothers folks. So they want to give him an alternative replacement behavior that he can do. And the team came up with he's going to stay still and silent during instruction. That's the expectation, right? Everyone else can do that. So let's give Marcus points when he is silent and still. The problem here is that that doesn't align to the function, right? Being silent and still doesn't allow Marcus to meet a sensory need for movement. So a point sheet for every class where he stays silent and still during instruction or tests is expecting Marcus to do something that he's telling us I have a need to do this other thing, right? It's not setting him up for success to earn points for something that doesn't match his need. Now, if the team came back and said, oh, we need a function based replacement behavior, right? We went to Krista and Rachel's webinar. We know what to do here. They switched it up. They said, we're going to make sure that Marcus has a way to get that sensory need met. So we're going to give him a drum pad or maybe even just a mouse pad, right? That'll dampen the sound. Or maybe we'll just teach him to drum on his hand or his leg instead. And when he does that, we're going to make sure to reinforce that. And he can know that that is a much easier and more effective way to get his needs met than clicking his pen or tapping his pencil on the desk or drumming or whatever it was that he was doing earlier that we identified as the challenging behavior. I want you to think of a recent behavior that you've seen. What is a functionally equivalent replacement behavior that you could try teaching a student? I'm going to put the replacement behaviors back up, but would love to hear in the chat how you might be thinking about this for a particular student. Michelle says for a student whose function of their behavior is attention, teaching them to use a signal card to request teacher or peer interaction. Yeah, right? They're going to try to meet that need somehow. That need isn't just going to extinguish and go away. So, how do we teach them to do it in an appropriate way? How do we incentivize them and create conditions where that's really easy to get that need met? I love that. Yeah, students who might again get attention in ways that are really disruptive, right? Being up and walking around a classroom, allow some scheduled time for that student to get that attention. Maybe they tell a joke, maybe they get a fun fact. I have had teachers have stacks of like appropriate joke cards, and if the student's a good reader and maybe a little theatrical, they've got time in their day to say, okay, we need a joke break. Come on up here, Carlos, come tell the class a joke. I love that. I did that I said joke breaks on a handout during a training, and someone goes, "Can you explain what a joke break is?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, those are so fun. You might want to bring a little joy to your class." Okay, we're gonna start shifting, right? A lot of what we've been talking about is what we are teaching the student to do, what we are helping them modify about their behavior. We're going to talk about prevention now. Right? Benjamin Franklin said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Now, he was talking about fire in the 1700s. He said, maybe we should do some stuff around this city to make fires less likely to happen. But like we can apply that to behavior too, right? We know it's often easier and just better for all of us if we can stop something before it happens rather than repair the damage after it already has. So we start to talk about function based antecedent strategies. Remember, the antecedent is the thing or the conditions that are in place before the behavior occurs. And so, if we focus our attention there too, in addition to thinking about those lagging skills and replacement behaviors, what can we adjust in the environment that would either remove the motivation for the behavior, right? Make tasks less averse, provide attention preemptively, or teach and reinforce alternative ways to meet those needs, like we've been talking about. Studies tell us, right, that when environmental modifications and proactive supports are in place, the frequency and the intensity of those challenging behaviors decrease significantly, right? Because the stimulus isn't there. So let's talk about some of the preventative strategies that we might use when we know the function of the behavior, because we know function-based strategies are just going to be more effective. Let's look at some of these examples by function. As you look at these, I would love for you to use the chat and tell us if there are any that are unfamiliar to you that you want us to explain a little further. We'll start with escape, right? If escape is the function, what we might do to set up in advance to be proactive is task dispersal. We would present a high probability task, something that the student can reliably do, something they're already good at, and then deliver the original demand, the thing that we know that they're probably going to want to try to escape. We build that momentum. We might offer support to complete the task proactively. They don't need to ask for it. We're just going to set up the support or adapt the task if we can. When it comes to access, right? We might allow the student to work for the item or activity and show them how they can do that, or provide the item or activity on a schedule, not contingent on any type of behavior. You're going to get the iPad every day at noon. For attention, we talked about this a little bit, right? Find opportunities for the student to get attention appropriately. That is a proactive strategy. We can teach them how to request it, sort of ad hoc, and we're going to build in those opportunities into their day. Or we might make plans to ignore the behavior, but not the student. And then finally, automatic and sensory, just having fidgets and stress balls available, offering breaks from the environment, knowing when you might need to take that proactive break. Super important. Again, this is where those related service providers, the OTs, the PTs, the behavior analysts are going to be really, really helpful thought partners in some of those proactive strategies. If there are any of these that are unfamiliar that you want us to dig into a little further, let us know in the chat. And if you're like, I get the list, which ones do you feel like you already frequently use with students? Go ahead and tell us in the chat. Ignoring, yeah. Making a plan for ignoring. Now, ignoring the behavior and not the student can be a delicate, tricky balance for teachers, right? Particularly newer teachers who've never maybe had an opportunity to see what that could look like. That might be something that's helpful to have modeled for you.
So some of those strategies were specific to certain behaviors once you have a working hypothesis about the function. But we also know that there are some things that are just good for all students. And so we're calling those universal supports. So these are great conditions to have in place that support all students, no matter the behavior. So, the first one we want to talk about is establishing clear expectations and predictable daily routines. So, making sure that you're having those clear classroom rules posted in the classroom, consistent procedures for transitions or signals when transitions are happening in classrooms, and then visual reminders of expectations in key areas of the classroom. You also want to consistently use positive reinforcement systems. So, if you have a behavioral system or using behavior specific praise that acknowledges effort and progress in the classroom is a great universal support. And then, of course, designing instruction that engages all learners. So, incorporating different participation strategies, such as a turn and talk, response cards, and movements in your daily instruction. Being able to provide choice in how students demonstrate their learning or how they engage in the classroom. Connecting students' interest to real world applications, and varying your instructional formats to maintain engagement for students. Another one we want to point to is optimizing the physical environment. So, making sure that you're arranging seating to promote positive peer interactions that minimize distractions, creating organized, clutter free spaces with clearly defined areas for students, and then providing proactive supports for transitions. So, giving advance warnings before transitions. So, saying 5 minutes until, 2 minutes until, um, and then building in brain breaks or movement opportunities throughout the day um, to support students' self-regulation and coping strategies. We want to share a resource with you all. This is a one-pager that lists some of these universal function-specific antecedent strategies and some guidance on how teams can use this list and reminders about how you might apply the strategies. So we're going to drop that in the chat. So feel free to bookmark that. It'll also go out with the materials from this session. So as we close, we have this quote here that I'll read aloud to you, but I want you all to take a minute and think about how, when we think about behavior as a skill um, that is taught, how that changes how you approach behavior. So Tom Herner says, when students struggle with academics, we offer instruction, practice, and support. Yet when students struggle with behavior, our first instinct is often punishment. But behavior, like reading or math, is a skill. If we want students to do better, we must teach, model, and reinforce the skills they need. So with that in mind, how does thinking about behavior as a skill change how you approach or think about challenging behavior? So feel free to share your answers in the chat. Take a moment to reflect. We'd love to hear kind of your takeaways. Awesome, Patrice.
Grace, we're going to share that ABC data collection sheet with folks when we share the recording. So hopefully that's a tool that you can find helpful as you're thinking about documenting behavior. I would also say, for something like that, ask for support for that if you can, right? Get someone to come in and observe for you. It's going to be really hard if it's happening while you're teaching. We're all superhuman when we're as teachers, but surely getting support from someone to come in and maybe help you collect that data might be very helpful. Rachel, I know for some of the folks that we've done behavior training with, the idea of lagging skill instruction has always felt like a bit of it like an aha moment, right? Folks will often come with a behavior plan for a student, or they'll think about, oh, we've tried everything, right? We've tried so many things. And then we start to talk about skill instruction, and the teams kind of start to look at each other like, oh, right. We've actually not come up with a good plan for when he or she is going to learn these new skills. We've always maybe just assumed that because they're in school and they're seeing peers model appropriate behavior that they're learning, right? Um, so I wonder if there's anything that you're thinking about when it comes to that lagging skill instruction that you see works really well or that you've noticed great teams do.
Yeah. I think when you start thinking about it in this way, it kind of shifts it from being like more reactive to more instructional. So thinking through how can you model the desired skill? How can you practice that together and then reinforce it? So kind of the same way you teach an academic skill, going through that learning process with students. I think a big takeaway for some schools also is more likely the importance of collecting data. So looking for those patterns and understanding the function more so that you can be more proactive in how you're problem solving around it versus being reactive in your response.
Right. And targeted, right? I have seen teams where, I mean, and they mean it. They think that they've tried everything. And maybe they actually are trying everything. And that's part of the problem, right? We're trying 4 or 5 different reactive responses, but none of them are targeted to the function of the behavior. They're like a smattering of things that might work if the behavior is attention seeking, and they might work if it's escape. And so we are throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. And we're all pretty exhausted. And I go back to that chart that we saw at the beginning of the call, right? The RAND survey results. People are stressed out by trying to do it all and trying to respond in behavior with all of the tools that they have. And sometimes it's not about doing more things, it's about doing a more strategic set of things. And I think that can often help folks stick with things longer and see if they're really working, collect that data. So, um, when I think about this as a skill, number one, I think about like how precise am I being in my articulation of those skills? What am I doing once I know the function? And also, like, have we made a great plan for that teaching and practice? Kid might need to get pulled in a small social skills group for a while, just like they would get pulled in a phonics group, right? Um, so those are some things that I think folks have told us. Like when we started to think about behavior as a skill, it shifted some of the things that we do habitually around challenging behavior because we just got more targeted. We got more specific. We're going to come back together. We're going to keep talking about behavior because there's no shortage of things we could talk about and dive into. So our next session is going to be the beginning of December, December 8th. We're going to shift the time to later in the day. So not your lunchtime, maybe right before or after dismissal. We're going to talk about some common mistakes that leaders are often making when addressing challenging behavior, right? So if you are a school leader, if you know a school leader that's also thinking a lot about challenging behavior, this will be a great session. Even if you're not a leader, these are also just some things that we notice like teams need help to make some shifts. Leaders are really well positioned to help make those shifts, but that doesn't mean that if you're a teacher who's struggling with individual student behavior, that this won't have great information for you to bring back to your team, or maybe to say, hey, I need support with this. Here's a tool that the ability challenge was talking about for leaders. Can we try to use this? Right. So we'll have the recording and the resources to share via email, just like we will for this one. So register for it. We'll send out the recording and the resources, whether you can attend or not. It's a good way to get all of the things that we're sharing around behavior. This is the link for registering for that session. So go ahead and register just so you get everything. And then we would love it if you would share your feedback with us about today's session. We'll send these resources out by early next week so that you can revisit this recording. You can revisit any of the resources that we talked about and referenced today. Um, and we would just love to know what was helpful. What do you want to learn more about? Tell us the topics that are on your mind or the questions that are plaguing you that keep you up at night when it comes to behavior, because we would love to incorporate that into our future conversations. Share your feedback so that we can make these sessions as applicable as possible and worth worth your lunch break. Carla, thanks for joining us. Carla, Carrie, Emily, Gabby, Michelle. So good to see familiar faces. Really excited to see some new names and some new folks on our list. You're so welcome. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you so much. Have a great day. I'm going to put our link for our survey as well, just in case you want to take it from the computer that you're already on. There's the link to our survey. And thank you so much for joining us.